Hello, everyone, and welcome to Uncivil Law, where we learn through the misfortunes of others. For today's content, I'm going to be talking a lot about the Daily Wire deal with Steven Crowder and my thoughts on the whole deal, because I think that it's an interesting issue about the difference between business relationships, friend relationships, how you approach deals, how you negotiate. I think both sides have some points. I think both sides have some faults. And so I'm going to just try to go through everything I sort of think on the issue so that they're all in one place. All right. So, first of all, what I think is true is that Daily Wire offered what it thought was the bare minimum deal necessary to get negotiations started. And you hear that basically from Jeremy Boring himself when he did his own video describing the whole deal. You hear him say, like, we had a call with his agent. The agent wanted to know the money. They told us a figure, and we offered what we thought was the minimum to get the negotiation started. So I think that Daily Wire's initial proposal was in some senses fair, but I also think that they thought it was the very bare minimum necessary to get the negotiation started, which is a bit odd if you look at it from a position of we're supposed to be friends for 10 years and Jeremy Boring saying, I've always looked for a position where I can work with Crowder. You know, before Blaze, before SCTV, before, I've always wanted to work with Crowder. He's someone that, and from time to time over the years, we've talked and fantasized about various ways that we could work together. So there seems to be some tension in the proposal versus some of what Jeremy Boring is saying. Because what Jeremy Boring is saying is we're friends. We've been friends for 10 years. I've always wanted to work with him. I know he's a talent. I know he's a great get. I know he's someone of value. We're friends. But at the same time, he's also saying, I offered him what I thought was the very bare minimum deal to get the negotiation started. This seems in odd tensions. And now from a pure business standpoint, in a lot of ways, what Jeremy Boring is doing makes sense. Because to do anything else from a straight business standpoint would be in some sense to negotiate against yourself. So if you think, like, for example, that they're going to come back and negotiate against you, which you know that they are, in some sense, it is prudent to leave yourself as much room as possible to negotiate, because why wouldn't you? So if you think that this is the very bare minimum necessary to get the talk started, then in some sense you are, well, first of all, you're doing two things. First of all, you're leaving yourself as much room to negotiate as possible. And second of all, you're anchoring, which is a common psychological tactic, right? It's one of the reasons that prices are set particular ways, is because you anchor negotiation to a particular price. It's one of the things that, like, if you set a house at $500,000, you know, that anchors the price. And if you set the house to a more precise number, like $495,000, that anchors the price differently. Like, it sounds like a 5,000 price difference, but the way people negotiate over those two different numbers in reality is very different. And this is like basic business stuff. You can read this in basic business books. So by offering a particular offer, it creates an anchor and also creates as much room as possible for you to negotiate. So it makes sense in that sense, but it doesn't make sense in a relationship where they're supposed to be friends, because you would think if they're friends, he would offer him a deal that would be more in line with what he thought Crowder wanted. And Jeremy Boring knows that. Well, he thinks he knows that to some degree, because he says that in his own video. He says this, we expected that he'd come back and he'd want fewer shows per year. We expected that he might want more money per show. We expected that he might want fewer penalties, right? So he already knows, or he at least thinks he knows, some of what Crowder wants. And he's not offering that to them in the first instance because, well, he wants as much room to negotiate as possible, which from a straight arm length, quasi-hostile transaction standpoint makes sense. From a position of we're friends for 10 years and I've always wanted to work with this guy and I've always admired his talent and I know what he's worth and I've always wanted an opportunity, less so. So the deal also doesn't quite make sense. And then, of course, there's some provisions in there that don't quite make sense in terms of the penalties that are to be incurred, because if you add up all the penalties, depending on how you're counting such things, but you arguably wind up with more than 100% penalties. So it depends a little bit about how that would be counted. The language is a little sloppy, but that's okay. It's an initial proposal, right? It hasn't been fully gone through by lawyers yet. So the fact that there's a little ambiguity in that, in terms of what the penalties would look like, in terms of how much those penalties would be, but depending on how you read it, if you read in such a way, you could get to 110%. That would be a reasonable read. Although, again, it's a little sloppy, so I don't think it's necessarily the only read, but it could be a position you could argue. So that's what I think about the initial proposal. What I think about what Crowder said made a lot of sense. There is also a lot of tension, or there is at least some arguable tension in Daily Wire's posture as it relates to social media. So Daily Wire has some tension in two senses in their proposal. Daily Wire has some tension in their proposal as it looks to a business relationship versus a friendship, right? There is some inconsistency in that sense, and you can see that, right? This is presented as a pure arm's length, quasi-hostile transaction, where we really think this is the bare minimum to leave ourselves as much room, but we're friends, right? So there's tension in those two viewpoints. The other place there's tension in Daily Wire's proposal is their view of the importance of social media. So there is a way to look at this in terms of the importance of using current social media and the revenue therefrom versus how you could get revenue in other sources. So there seems to be, and this seems to be the biggest point of difference between the two, is to what degree, if any, is current social media, current big tech valuable to Daily Wire, or for that matter, Crowder, as a business enterprise? What is the value in that? So Daily Wire looks at this from their own transactional standpoint, and the way they treat it is we want to get money from as many sources as possible, which makes sense, right? We're a business. We like money, yay money. We want to get business from as many sources as possible. So what we're going to do as a company is we're going to put out content on traditional social media, such as YouTube, such as Spotify, such as Apple Podcasts, such as whatever. And that's going to bring in some revenue. In order to do that, we need to make sure our content is in conformity to those platforms' guidelines. If we want that money, we have to make sure that our content is in conformity to our those guidelines. We think we can do that. We think that we can live within those guidelines and get that money and spread our message. We think that we can do all those things at the same time. Crowder is somewhat more dubious on this proposition, but that's what Daily Wire seems to think, right? And so Daily Wire is like, well, if we're on YouTube, for example, and we're monetized, that's a source of income for us. That's valuable to us as a business. And then we'll also have content that's separate and apart from that, that's behind our paywall for our members. And that way they can also get that content as well. So we can say what we want to say on social media in perhaps a slightly more sanitized version, and then a more unsanitized version behind the paywall. And what they seem to be thinking is that if we lose the YouTube revenue, for example, then we lose that YouTube revenue. But what they don't know is whether that's one-to-one. And that's where some guesswork comes into mind. Because if, for example, Daily Wire were to lose YouTube, demonetized or banned, what would that do for them on their platform, their private platform? What would that do for them? And this is where it's some guesswork on both Daily Wire and Crowder's standpoint. What does that do for us as a business? Crowder seems to think that being demonetized or being banned would lead to increased Mug Club subscriptions, for example. And that the ability to do that would allow him to have a more pure version and in the end bring him more money, or at least allow him to spread a message that is more pure, right? He says he doesn't care about the money. Let's assume that that's true. Or let's assume that he doesn't care about the money as much, right? Because these are all about competing priorities. What do you care about? What do you want, right? And where do these priorities lack? So let's assume that Crowder doesn't care about the money as much. So he's like, even if I lose out financially because I'm demonetized or banned, First, I'll recover some of that money from Mug Club subscriptions. And perhaps more to the point, I can be more pure on my message, which is more important to me, right? Daily Wire's like, well, we don't know that it's a one-for-one substitution. We don't know that by being banned or demonetized, we'll necessarily recover all that. For us, the money is a more important priority compared to Crowder, because we're trying to do really expensive things as a company, Daily Wire. We're trying to produce these huge documentaries. We're trying to produce these huge movies. We're trying to produce these huge things, and so for us, the money is a major consideration. So we want to have our cake and eat it too. We want to try to serve, if not even two masters, multiple masters. And I think Crowder is also to some degree doing that too. He's also trying to serve multiple masters, and it's just the priority of those masters is different than Daily Wire. So it's like, well, you can view this, to what degree is the message being compromised by being on YouTube, and is the compromise in message worth the money, right? So this is just a cold calculation. In some sense, this is a cold business calculation. How important is the money to you versus how important is the message to you? To what degree are you compromising the message? To what degree are you compromising the money? Is it a good trade-off? This is just like a calculation. It's a calculation of priorities. So it seems to be like for Daily Wire, the way that they calculate that priority trade-off of money versus purity of message is different than Crowder. I don't think Crowder is 100% pure. I don't think that's true. I do think he's more pure than Daily Wire. And I don't think that Daily Wire is 100% monetary focused. That's not true. But I think they're more monetary focused than Crowder in their comparative priorities. And so you see this reflected in their stuff. So, so Crowder is calling them out on hypocrisy. It's like, you say that you don't want big tech, and Daily Wire's like, well, we know that this probably won't last forever. We know that eventually we're going to be banned from these platforms. But as long as and of course, the platforms in and of themselves help get their message out and bring attention to them so that people will know that they exist. Crowder not being on YouTube would presumably bring less people to his attention. And it would make it harder for him to get Mug Club subscribers. The degree to which that's true, it's presumably true that YouTube is a valuable platform to him as an advertising tool, if not a monetary tool, right? Because he's been demonetized for a long time, but still valuable to him as a promotion tool. And that fact, the promotion tool is basically an ad for him, is what it turned into, which helps bring him Mug Club subscribers. If he were to lose that completely, then he presumably would no longer have that advertising tool, which means that he loses the attention, which loses him subscribers to his platform. And the degree to which that is a problem for him or not is, of course, a calculation. So that is what I think about that. And, of all that. Crowder also has to consider, his own production costs, and so does Daily Wire for that matter. So Daily Wire has to consider, their overhead and what they want to do and paying their staff. And Crowder, of course, has to consider paying his staff, especially since the proposal, the term sheet, suggests that he be responsible for the production. But of course, that could be a term that couldn't be negotiated. But he has to worry about that too. He has to worry about paying them. But he has to worry about the problem anyway, right? He has to worry about if he goes out on his own, and if he truly divorces himself completely of big tech, if he truly does that, will he be able to pay the bills? Is he going to choose to turn off his own YouTube channel, for example? I haven't seen him do that so far. So Crowder says, well, I'm pure, I don't care about it, but he hasn't turned off his own YouTube channel. So he seems like he cares about it, at least in some sense, as a promotion tool. And he knows that he has to conform himself to some degree to keep YouTube as a promotion platform. If he didn't care about YouTube at all, he'd just turn it off, but he hasn't. So I think even Crowder compromises himself to some degree. And I think that he's less pure than he perhaps pretends to be, but perhaps more pure than Daily Wire and sort of the balance of the calculation. So that's what I sort of think about the whole deal. I also think that Crowder was a dick for releasing the telephone call. Putting aside the legality of it, which is probably legal, although we have to get into specifically where these people were at the time, because depending on where they are and we're dealing with cross-state boundaries, we can get into some complications. But to my knowledge, Texas, where Crowder is, and Tennessee and Florida, where Daily Wire are all one-party consent states. Now, that assumes, of course, that Crowder and Boring were in those states at the time, which I don't know. So I'm not going to say that the call was or was not legal, because I don't know. There's complications when you're dealing with these issues. What I will say is that I think it was dickish for him to release the call. It makes sense to record the call, especially as part of a business negotiation. So you can go back and listen to it and stuff like that, and you can go back and use it as a reference point. It makes sense to record the call, but I think it was pretty dickish to release the call. I don't see the point in it other than burning a bridge, which Crowder seemed to go a little bit out of his way not to do in the first instance, because Crowder was, in the way he discussed the term sheet, he left out the names. And there was lots of speculation about what the names were. Daily Wire was certainly in the conversation, but at least the way that I perceived the social media conversation, they weren't even necessarily the leader. It seemed like the leader was Fox, from my at least perception of the discussion, in terms of who was making the deal or who was making the proposal. And Crowder himself said that a lot of the terms were not atypical for proposals. So he seems to go out of his way to insulate, well, if not out of his way, he insulated Daily Wire. Daily Wire choosing to out themselves was a bit of a strange move in some senses. I don't really understand the logic behind that in some senses. I think that Crowder releasing the phone call was a dick move. If he wanted to talk about it more, he could even reference things that were said on the phone call, because he could always be talking about it from his memory. But he secretly knows he has it on tape, so he knows what he's saying is true or not. But I think releasing the call was dickish, and I don't think was prudent, and I think has created division within the conservative movement. And I think that, for example, Ben Shapiro perceiving it as being set up because of the time in which the domain StopBigCon was registered. It was registered before the phone call. And so Ben Shapiro perceives that he and his partners were being set up to have this phone call to get incriminating statements for his own purposes. And he feels like that's a betrayal of friendship, which I totally understand. I'd feel that too. And he feels like that, was going on. So I think that's their biggest point. I'd be interested to see what Crowder does going forward in terms of how he treats this for himself. Because Crowder says, well, I don't care about big tech. Okay, to what degree is that really true? Is my interesting question to him. Do you not really care about YouTube at all? If so, why do you have a YouTube channel? You're not monetized over there, but you see it as an advertising opportunity, don't you? If you didn't, why do you have a YouTube channel at all? Is the only reason maybe the only reason he has a YouTube channel is because he's waiting to be banned so he can grift off of it. Maybe that's his motivation. I don't know. But he seems to be producing segments on YouTube, at least, that are in conformity to YouTube guidelines. He doesn't seem to be going out of his way to antagonize YouTube, although, of course, YouTube can be antagonized for any number of reasons. So, it's a problem. So that's my sort of take on the whole thing. I think that Daily Wire has some tension in their proposal. There is a lot of tension in their proposal between Crowder as friend and Crowder as business partner. That's one tension. I think there's also tension in their view of social media as a tool for even, just purely monetary purposes versus Crowder's vision. And I think Crowder also, at least in the way he treats social media, is not as pure as he suggests. And I think releasing the call was dickish. Those are all the things I think. So hopefully that answers all the questions, and I look forward to what I'm sure will be insightful commentary and comments in the video below.